Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're tracing a truly fascinating domino effect, one that totally transformed 18th century North America from a powerful indigenous stronghold into the birthplace of American independence. We often think of the American Revolution as this story that just magically starts in Boston or Philadelphia. But honestly, the real seeds were sown much earlier, deep in the frontier woods and on battlefields literally halfway across the world. So, we're going to explore a pretty unexpected question. How exactly did Britain's greatest global victory end up costing them their American empire? It's a classic historical paradox, right? Winning the biggest war the world had ever seen inadvertently created the absolute perfect storm for losing the jewel of the British Empire. Here's our agenda for today. 1. Indigenous power and diplomacy. 2. The First Global War. 3. Pontiac's War of Resistance. And 4. The Seeds of Revolution. Section 1. Indigenous Power and Diplomacy. Let's bust a major myth right out of the gate. Despite all the European colonial growth, indigenous nations held the real power in 18th century North America. A perfect piece of proof here is the 1764 English copy of the Deerskin Catawba map. It maps out the territory between Charleston and Virginia, and it clearly shows that the vast majority of this land remained firmly in the hands of indigenous people. They were operating these incredibly complex networks, dictating the terms of trade and diplomacy, and, quite frankly, effectively playing European powers right against each other. A prime example of this political sophistication is the Haudenosaunee League. Comprised of 6 distinct Iroquoian nations, they formed one of the world's oldest participatory democracies, and they were so incredibly effective at governing and maintaining dominion over the massive area between the Hudson and Mississippi rivers that Benjamin Franklin actually admired their political system. He even used it as direct inspiration when he proposed a colonial alliance at the Albany Congress in 1754. Think about why this matters. Early American democratic ideals were heavily inspired by indigenous governance. How cool is that? Section 2. The First Global War. Now, that careful balance of power we just talked about, it was completely shattered by the 7 Years' War. Interestingly enough, it began right in North America in 1754, sparked by a skirmish involving a young, relatively unknown guy named George Washington. Yeah, that George Washington, who led an attack that killed a French diplomat. What started as a clash in the American woods quickly escalated by 1756 into what a lot of historians consider the first true global war, drawing in massive coalitions across Europe, India, and even the Philippines. Just to grasp the sheer scale of this thing, while Anglo-American militias were fighting brutal frontier battles against the French and their indigenous allies in North America, the British were fighting entirely different campaigns simultaneously. Thousands of miles away, Lord Robert Clive and his British forces were defeating the French and their allies at the Battle of Plassey in India. Meanwhile, the British fleet was busy securing the world's oceans. This was a truly worldwide struggle for supremacy. Following their massive global victory in 1763, the British decided to completely flip the script on diplomacy in North America. See, the French had maintained relative stability through gift-giving, well, diplomatic gift-giving to be precise. But the British, they decided they wanted to act as strict rulers and extract profit. British General Geoffrey Amherst halted those gifts, heavily regulated the trade of firearms and ammunition, and drastically lowered the trade price for furs. It was a massive shock to the system. In fact, it was so severe that Amherst even suggested using biological warfare, famously proposing sending smallpox-infested blankets to the Delaware people. Just incredibly arrogant and brutal. Section 3. Pontiac's War of Resistance. Now, indigenous nations knew this new British approach wasn't just frugal policy, it was preparation for absolute subjugation. The spiritual and existential stakes really crystallized in 1761. A prophet named Nealon received a powerful vision from his religion's main deity, the Master of Life. And the message was crystal clear. The only way to enter heaven was to completely cast off this corrupting European influence. He preached unity among indigenous people to drive the British out, which laid a fierce ideological foundation for what was coming next. Inspired by Nealon's teachings, leaders like the Ottawa Chief Pontiac launched a massive, highly coordinated war in 1763. And the tactics they used? Absolutely brilliant. Take this real-life Trojan horse event at Fort Michilimackinac. A coalition of Ojibways and Ottawas staged a massive game of stickball, an early form of lacrosse, right outside the fort. During the game, they intentionally chased the ball through the fort's open gates. Once inside, they dropped their sticks, grabbed weapons that indigenous women had cleverly smuggled in beforehand, and completely overwhelmed the British soldiers to capture the fort.
And you know what? Pontiac's war was highly effective. Indigenous warriors captured multiple forts and fundamentally altered British policy. The British Crown finally had to recognize that coercion simply wasn't working. So, to buy peace, they issued the Royal Proclamation of 1763. This sweeping decree essentially drew a massive line right down the Appalachian Mountains, strictly prohibiting Anglo-American colonists from settling in the newly acquired and highly coveted Ohio River Valley.
Section 4. The Seeds of Revolution. Now we get to the real fallout. These wars would ultimately alienate the exact same colonists who had just bled and fought for the British Crown. And it all comes down to this astronomical number, 140 million pounds. Britain was left with a staggering $140 million debt from fighting this massive global war. To put that into perspective, it was a completely unprecedented financial crisis for the empire at the time. Parliament looked at this massive bill and decided, hey, the 13 American colonies are enjoying peace and security now, so they need to open their wallets and pay for it. So, to recoup those costs, Parliament began aggressively legislating over the colonies in ways they rarely, if ever, had before. They rolled out a slew of unprecedented taxes on everyday items. We're talking tea, paper, molasses, and stamps for legal documents. On top of that, they started eroding deeply held civil liberties, like jury trials and protections against unlawful searches. You had all that to the bitter disappointment of the Proclamation Line blocking their westward expansion, plus growing fears among some that Britain might soon restrict slavery, and man, you have a massive pressure cooker of resentment just waiting to explode. What you really should take away from all this is how this shared struggle totally forced a paradigm shift. Having fought side by side during the 7 Years' War, with tens of thousands of colonial soldiers serving together, these separate squabbling colonies began to view themselves as a collective group. They were suddenly united by their shared resentment of these new British policies. This perfectly brought to life an idea Benjamin Franklin had seeded years earlier with his famous 1754 Join or Die cartoon. The colonies were finally starting to join. This entire shared experience essentially forged a brand new cultural identity. It was perfectly summarized a bit later by the French immigrant Crève Gaucheur, who famously asked, "What then is the American, this new man?" He noted that this new man was a self-reliant individual, fiercely independent, driven by their own interests, and entirely free from the rigid burdens of the old European class system. A distinct, unified identity was rapidly solidifying across those 13 colonies. So, I'm going to leave you with this provocative thought. As this new, fiercely self-reliant American identity solidified, and as Britain desperately doubled down on extracting wealth and enforcing control to pay off their global war debt, was a peaceful resolution ever really possible? Or was an all-out conflict with an overbearing British Empire no longer just a possibility, but an absolute inevitability? Thanks so much for joining me for this explainer, and keep questioning the history you think you know.